The night was cold, the air heavy with the scent of damp asphalt. A thin mist lingered in the empty streets, wrapping around the lone figure stumbling along the sidewalk. His paws dragged, his legs shook, and his breathing was slow and labored. Stryker, once a proud and powerful K-9 officer, was now nothing more than a shadow of what he used to be. His coat was dirty and matted, his ribs pressed against his thin skin, and his once sharp amber eyes had lost their fire. He wasn't sure where he was going anymore. Maybe nowhere. Maybe it didn't matter. Instinct told him to keep moving, but every step felt heavier than the last. Then his body gave out. His legs buckled, and he collapsed onto the cold pavement of a dark alley. His chest rose and fell in slow, painful movements. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 20 long years pressing down on him. This was it. This was how it ended. For the first time in his life, he didn't fight it. The world around him faded into silence until he heard footsteps. Soft at first, hesitant, then growing closer. Car door shut. Keys jingled. Someone was near. He didn't have the strength to move, but he could hear them kneeling beside him. Then a voice, gentle and uncertain. "Oh my God!" A woman. She hesitated before reaching out, her fingers brushing against his damp fur. No reaction, no growl, nothing. He had nothing left to give. That's when she saw the old, battered collar around his neck. The metal tag was scratched and worn, but still legible. Stryker. She froze, her stomach twisted. She knew that name, but from where? Her mind raced as she stared at the half-dead dog lying in front of her. This wasn't just any stray. Stryker's breathing slowed. His eyelids fluttered. For a moment, his blurry vision focused on her face. And in that split second, something familiar flickered in his fading memory. Then, everything went black. The woman sucked in a sharp breath, panic tightening her chest. Was he gone? Then barely there. She felt it. A slow, fragile breath. He was still alive, but just barely. Her hands shook as she carefully lifted him, feeling how frail he had become. She didn't know who this dog really was or why her heart was pounding so hard in her chest. But something inside her whispered, "This is not just a stray." Without another second to waste, she carried him to her car and drove away. Stryker's story wasn't over yet. Not tonight. The car was silent except for the rhythmic hum of the engine and the soft tapping of rain against the windshield. The woman gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, as she stole another glance at the back seat. Stryker lay motionless, his frail body barely rising with each breath. His fur, once thick and proud, was dull and matted. He looked so small, so fragile, nothing like the powerful K-9 he had once been. But what struck her most was the name on his worn collar. It tugged at something buried deep in her mind, a memory just out of reach. Her foot pressed harder on the gas. A retired K-9 should never have ended up alone, starving in the streets. These dogs were heroes, trained to serve and protect. They were supposed to be cared for, honored. So why had Stryker been left to die? The thought gnawed at her, filling her with unease. She didn't know his story, but she knew one thing. Someone had abandoned him, and that meant someone somewhere had answers. A faint whimper broke the silence. She inhaled sharply and glanced over her shoulder. Stryker's paws twitched, his eyelids fluttering, his body caught in some unseen battle. Was he dreaming or remembering? A deep, guttural whine escaped him, and for a split second, she saw something flicker in his tired eyes, fear. Whatever haunted him wasn't done with him yet. The shelter appeared in the distance, its dimly lit sign barely visible through the rain. She pulled into the parking lot, her heart pounding, and jumped out, rushing to the back seat. For a terrifying moment, she thought she was too late. He wasn't moving. But then she saw it. A slow, fragile rise of his chest. He was still here, but for how much longer? Taking a deep breath, she carefully lifted him, shocked at how light he was. He had once been strong, muscular. Now he felt like a ghost of what he used to be. Inside, the shelter's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as a vet technician rushed forward. "What happened?" the tech asked, eyes widening at the sight of the broken dog in her arms. "He's a retired K9, the woman managed to say, her voice shaking. That was all it took. Within seconds, Stryker was on an exam table, the vet's hands moving gently over his frail body. "Severely malnourished," he muttered. "Old wounds. Some healed, some not." His fingers brushed against the faded metal tag. His eyes lifted to meet hers. "A retired K9 doesn't end up like this by accident," he said carefully. "If he has a past, someone might still be looking for him." Her stomach tightened. Someone might still be looking for him. But what if the person who left him behind was the last person he needed to see? Stryker's body remained still on the exam table, his breathing shallow but steady. The soft beeping of a heart monitor filled the small room, a reminder that, despite everything, he was still fighting. The woman stood a few feet away, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her mind racing. The vet's words echoed in her head. If he has a past, someone might still be looking for him, but something about that thought unsettled her. If someone had truly cared about him, he wouldn't have ended up half dead in a filthy alley. Someone had abandoned him. Someone had made the choice to let him suffer alone. And yet, deep inside, she felt an undeniable pull toward this dog, a sense that their paths weren't crossing by accident. The vet, Dr. Reynolds, carefully examined Stryker's collar again, running his fingers over the faded engraving on the metal tag. "This ID number, it looks like an old department issue," he muttered. He reached for his phone, snapping a picture. "I'll run it through some contacts. See if we can find out where he came from." She nodded but said nothing. Did she really want to know? Her eyes fell on Stryker's frail frame. His paws twitched slightly, his brow furrowed as if he was lost in a dream or a memory. She took a slow breath. Whatever he had been through, it hadn't let go of him. Inside the darkness of his mind, Stryker was running. His muscles burned. His breath came in sharp bursts. The distant sound of shouting filled his ears. Gunfire. A sharp command, his handler's voice. "Stryker, down." He obeyed without hesitation, his body hitting the dirt as bullets whizzed past him. Then pain. A sharp, searing pain in his side. The world blurred. His handler's voice grew distant. His collar snapped free. He was falling into the night, alone. Then silence. Stryker's body jerked. A low, pained whimper escaped his throat, pulling the woman's attention back to him. She stepped closer, instinctively reaching out, her fingers hovering just above his head. He looked so fragile, so lost. "I've seen this before," Dr. Reynolds said quietly. "K9s. They don't just forget," he exhaled, shaking his head. "Whatever happened to him, it's still with him. They relive it over and over." The woman swallowed hard. She already knew that. She had seen it before in people. A sudden vibration in the vet's pocket made them both jump. He pulled out his phone, glancing at the screen. His expression shifted, his jaw tightening slightly. "What?" she asked, her voice sharp. He hesitated. "I sent the ID number to a contact in law enforcement." He got a hit. He looked down at Stryker, then back at her. "This dog has a file. A long one." Her pulse quickened. Where was he stationed? Dr. Reynolds took a slow breath. He was a police K9 in Chicago. Her heart nearly stopped. Chicago. She hadn't been back there in years. Had spent a long time trying to forget. Now, a half-dead dog from a past she'd buried had just fallen into her lap, and she had a feeling that whatever had happened to him was far from over. The room felt smaller, the air pressing against her chest as the weight of the name settled in her mind. Chicago. Of all places, it had to be Chicago. She hadn't been back in years, had worked hard to leave it behind. Yet here she was, standing over a half-dead K9 with a past that was now clawing its way back into her life. Dr. Reynolds tapped at his phone, his expression unreadable as he scrolled through whatever information his contact had sent. "Stryker was with CPD's K9 unit for nearly a decade," he said finally. "Specialized in search and rescue, narcotics detection, and..." He hesitated, his eyes flicking up to meet hers. "And what?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Dr. Reynolds exhaled. He was assigned to an elite tactical unit. High-risk operations, drug busts, gang takedowns, hostage situations. The kind of cases that don't always make the news. The ones that go bad before they go public. His fingers traced the edges of his phone as if weighing whether to continue. And his last mission. It didn't end well. Her stomach tightened as she looked down at Stryker's frail, motionless body. What had he been through? What had he seen? She had spent enough years around law enforcement to know that didn't end well usually meant something had gone horribly, irreversibly wrong. Dr. Reynolds cleared his throat. His handler was Officer Daniel Monroe. Does that name mean anything to you? The world around her seemed to still. Danny Monroe. It had been years since she last heard that name, but the memories rushed in as if no time had passed at all. Long nights in briefing rooms, the hum of police radios, the weight of a badge she no longer carried. And Monroe, her partner, her friend, the man who had trusted her with his life. She could still picture his tired grin, the way he ruffled Stryker's ears after a job well done, the way his voice turned sharp and commanding in the field. She forced herself to swallow the lump in her throat. Yeah, she said quietly. I knew him. Dr. Reynolds studied her for a moment before looking back at his phone. Monroe left CPD shortly after Stryker disappeared. He resigned, no explanation, no transfer request. Just walked away. He hesitated before adding, there's no trace of him after that. No new department. No forwarding address. It's like he vanished. A cold feeling crept up her spine. Cops don't just disappear. Not without a reason. Not unless something forced them out. Her gaze fell back to Stryker, his slow, steady breaths the only sign that he was still fighting. The scars beneath his fur, the way his body twitched as if caught in a memory. Whatever happened on that last mission, it hadn't let him go. And now, for some reason, that past had led him straight to her. The pieces didn't fit. A decorated K-9 abandoned to die. A handler who vanished without a trace. A past she had tried to bury now clawing its way back to the surface. She exhaled slowly, forcing her mind to stay clear. There was only one way to get answers. She had to go back to Chicago. The decision weighed on her like a stone in her chest. Going back to Chicago wasn't part of the plan. She had spent years putting distance between herself and that city, convincing herself that she had moved on, that some doors were meant to stay closed. But now, standing in this shelter, staring at the broken dog lying on the exam table, she knew there was no running from this. Stryker's past was tangled with hers, whether she wanted to face it or not. Dr. Reynolds handed her a clipboard with some paperwork. If you're taking him, you'll need to sign as his temporary guardian. He needs time to recover before making any kind of trip. His voice was careful, but she caught the unspoken words behind it. Are you sure you want to do this? She didn't hesitate as she scribbled her name on the line. How long until he's strong enough to travel? Dr. Reynolds sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. A week, maybe more. He's dehydrated, malnourished, and his body's been running on empty for too long. He needs rest, proper meals, and a safe place. He met her gaze. And he needs someone patient. He's not just healing physically. Whatever happened to him didn't just break his body. It broke something inside him too. Her chest tightened as she glanced at Stryker again. She understood that kind of damage. Some wounds didn't heal with time. Some stayed buried, surfacing only when you least expected them. She exhaled. I can handle it. That night, she set up a makeshift bed for Stryker in her small apartment. A thick blanket in the corner of the living room, a water bowl, and the soft hum of a nearby space heater to keep him warm. He barely moved when she settled him down, only offering a small, exhausted sigh before his body sank into sleep. She sat nearby, watching him, trying to piece together the puzzle of who he was and what had happened to him. Why had Monroe left? Why had Stryker been discarded like an afterthought? The questions circled in her mind, refusing to settle. Her phone sat on the coffee table, glowing softly with an open search tab. Daniel Monroe. No social media, no recent news. Just old articles, commendations, high-profile arrests, and then nothing. Clean break, like he had never existed past that final case. She sighed, rubbing her temples. She knew what she had to do. She would have to dig deeper, call in favors, pull at threads she had sworn never to touch again. She had walked away from that world once, but now it was pulling her back in. A soft whimper pulled her from her thoughts. Stryker shifted slightly, his paws twitching. His breaths came faster, uneven, like he was caught in a memory he couldn't escape. She moved closer, reaching out carefully. "Hey," she said softly. "You're safe now." His ears flicked slightly, but he didn't wake. His body remained tense, locked in something far beyond her reach. She leaned back, watching him, feeling the weight of the past settle over them both. Chicago had the answers, and whether she was ready or not, she was going to find them. Morning light slipped through the blinds, casting soft shadows across the floor. The apartment was quiet except for the steady rhythm of Stryker's breathing. He hadn't moved much, only shifting slightly in his sleep. His fur was rough, interrupted by old scars. He didn't flinch when she touched him, but there was no recognition in his eyes. He was here, but part of him was somewhere else. She grabbed her phone from the counter. Hours of searching had led to nothing. Daniel Monroe had vanished. No addresses, no employment records, like he had been erased. That didn't happen by accident. She dialed a number she hadn't called in years. After 2 rings, a groggy voice answered. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" "Still sleeping in, Carter?" She smirked. A sharp inhale. "No way. Is this who I think it is?" "It's me. Damn. Thought you were dead." "Not yet." A sigh on the other end. "All right. If you're calling me, it's not for small talk. What do you need?" "Daniel Monroe. I need to know where he went after CPD. Anything you can find." Silence. Then a low whistle. "Monroe? That case was messy. Internal affairs got involved, and then nothing. Nobody talks about it." She frowned. "That's not normal." "No, it's not." Carter hesitated. "You sure you want to dig into this?" Her eyes drifted to Stryker, his paws twitching in his sleep, lost in a memory only he could see. "I don't have a choice," she said. Carter sighed. "Give me a few hours." The call ended. She tossed the phone onto the couch and glanced at the packed duffel bag by the door. She was going back to Chicago, and this time she wasn't leaving without answers. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, the city skyline growing larger with every mile. The air inside the car was tense, filled only by the soft hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of Stryker's breathing from the passenger seat. He was still weak but improving, his body no longer trembling with every movement. He stared out the window, ears flicking at the occasional sound, as if sensing that he was heading toward something familiar, or something he'd rather forget. She tightened her grip on the wheel, her mind racing. Chicago hadn't been home in years, and returning now felt like stepping onto unstable ground. Too many memories, too many loose ends, and now a ghost from the past had pulled her back in. Carter had promised information, but she knew better than to expect easy answers. If Monroe had truly disappeared, there was a reason, and whatever had happened to Stryker was tied to it. Traffic thickened as she entered the city, the towering buildings casting long shadows over the streets. She pulled into a small motel lot on the outskirts of downtown, knowing better than to stay anywhere too obvious. Old habits died hard. Stryker shifted beside her, his amber eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. When she reached over to unclip his harness, he flinched slightly before exhaling and stepping out. It was muscle memory, years of training reacting before his mind could stop it. Inside the room, she set down her bag and pulled out her phone. A new message from Carter flashed on the screen. "Meet me at O'Hara's. 9 p.m. Got something?" She sighed, rubbing her temples. O'Hara's was a dive bar, a cop hangout, the kind of place where conversations happened in whispers and favors were traded like currency. She glanced at Stryker, who had already curled up on the motel floor, his breathing slow but steady. She sat on the bed, staring at him, feeling the weight of everything closing in. Monroe had vanished, Stryker had been left for dead, and now she was chasing a past she had sworn to leave behind. Whatever waited for her in Chicago, she had a feeling it was just the beginning. The dim glow of the neon O'Hara's bar sign flickered against the rain-slicked pavement as she pulled into the nearly full parking lot. The place hadn't changed. Same cracked asphalt, same faded brick exterior, same crowd of off-duty cops drowning their stress in cheap whiskey. Felt like stepping into a past life. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and low conversation. She spotted Carter immediately, seated in a booth at the back, a half-empty beer in front of him. He looked up as she approached, a smirk forming. "Didn't think you'd actually show." She slid into the seat across from him. "What do you have on Monroe?" Carter leaned back, running a hand over his jaw. "Not much, which is exactly what makes this interesting. His file is clean, too clean. Like someone wiped it. No financial records, no property ownership, not even a damn phone bill in the last 5 years." He took a sip of his beer. "It's like he never existed after he left CPD." Her stomach tightened. This wasn't just a cop going off the grid. Someone had erased him. What about his last case? Carter hesitated, then slid a folded piece of paper across the table. "This is the last report he filed before everything went sideways. A drug bust on the south side, but something went wrong. No details, no follow-up reports. Just ended." His voice dropped lower. "And Stryker? His name was all over it. Then nothing." She unfolded the paper, scanning the brief, official-sounding words. Something about it felt wrong. Her fingers tightened around the edges. Carter leaned in. Whatever happened that night, it didn't just make Monroe disappear. It buried Stryker too. Back at the motel, she spread the report across the small wooden table, her eyes scanning every line, every word, searching for something, anything, that could explain why Daniel Monroe had disappeared and why Stryker had been left to die. The case seemed routine on paper, a drug bust in an abandoned warehouse on the south side. But the more she read, the more the gaps stood out. No suspects named, no arrests recorded, no official statement from Monroe, just a single page of vague descriptions, as if someone had wanted to erase what really happened that night. Stryker lay on the floor nearby, his breathing steady but alert. He watched her with quiet intensity, his amber eyes following every movement. He had been there that night, he had seen everything. But whatever had happened, it had left him not just physically broken, but haunted. A K-9 doesn't just end up abandoned without reason. Someone had made sure he was forgotten. She grabbed her phone and dialed Carter. He answered almost immediately. "Tell me you have something," she said, pacing the room. "There's a name missing from that report," Carter said. His voice was tense, like he had been waiting for her call. Someone higher up had to be involved. She stopped pacing. "Who?" Carter sighed. "Took some digging, but I found an internal affairs complaint filed against Monroe a week before he disappeared. It was classified. That kind of thing doesn't happen unless someone powerful is protecting themselves." He hesitated before continuing. "The officer who filed it? Lieutenant James Holloway." Her stomach tightened. Holloway. That name pulled at something buried deep in her memory. One of those cops who always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. He had moved up the ranks faster than anyone else, always just beyond suspicion, always untouchable. If he was involved, this wasn't just about a failed drug bust. This was something bigger. She turned to Stryker, whose ears had perked slightly at the change in her tone. "Holloway," she said softly, almost testing the name. Stryker's body stiffened. His breathing changed, just for a second. A reaction, not just to her voice but to the name itself. He remembered, and now so did she. Whatever happened that night, Monroe had tried to stop it, and someone had made sure he paid the price. The weight of the truth pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating. Holloway. The name had been in front of her this entire time, buried beneath redacted files and erased records, hidden where no one was supposed to look. But now that she had found it, she couldn't ignore it. Monroe hadn't just disappeared, he had been erased. And Stryker? He had been discarded like evidence that someone didn't want found. She crouched beside the old K-9, running a careful hand over his head. His reaction to Holloway's name had been subtle, but it had been there. A flicker of tension, a change in his breathing. He remembered, even through his exhaustion, through the pain and scars, he still carried the ghosts of that night. She could see it in the way his ears twitched at every distant sound, the way his body stayed coiled, ready to move even in sleep. Her mind raced through the possibilities. If Holloway had been the one to file the complaint against Monroe, then he had been involved in whatever went wrong. And if Monroe had tried to stop it, that was reason enough to disappear him. But what had he seen that was so dangerous, so damning, that it had required covering up the existence of an entire police K-9? Whatever happened in that warehouse, it had left behind too many loose ends. She exhaled sharply and grabbed her phone, her fingers steady as she typed a message. I need to see Holloway. Face to face. It was reckless, maybe even stupid, but she wasn't going to get answers by sitting in a motel room. She needed to force his hand, to make him know that someone was digging. If he had gone this far to bury the truth, she wanted to see how far he was willing to go to keep it hidden. Stryker stirred beside her, shifting slightly but not fully waking. He was still weak, but something told her he wasn't done fighting. And neither was she. Whatever happened next, she wasn't walking away this time. She had left this city once, but Chicago had never let go of her. Not really. She turned toward the window, staring out at the dark skyline stretching beyond the motel parking lot. The past wasn't finished with her. And now, for the first time in years, she was ready to face it. One way or another, the truth was coming out.